There are a handful of rules known as idioms. Idioms are simple, specific rules that apply to very narrow situations, and there oftentimes isn't a specific rhyme or reason behind the rule, it's just the way we say things. And while there are literally hundreds of idioms in the English language, there are about 10 or so that are very commonly tested on your exam, and for the rest we'll discuss how to approach those in the strategies video. The first idioms to know are the difference between if and whether. The full idiom for if is if, then. And the full idiom for whether is whether or not. Now usually the then and the or not are actually omitted for the sake of brevity, to make the sentence shorter. However, when the if and the whether are used correctly, there should still be a spot where you could put the then or where you could put the or not. We use if when we're showing consequence. If something happens, then this will happen later. Whether is when we're undecided on two possible outcomes. So in the top example, we only talk about what's going to happen if it rains. And the bottom example addresses two possibilities. It's going to rain, or it's not going to rain. In this example, the sentence tries to use the idiom if. But remember, the full idiom is actually if, then. And while the sentence doesn't have to use the actual word then, there has to be a spot where you would put the then, the consequence if the first action actually occurs. And if you read through this sentence, there really isn't a spot to put the then. But if we wrote in whether and added the or not, that actually makes sense. The company's success depends on whether or not it can appeal to wealthier customers. We can try the same approach here with the whether. To make sure it fits, we're going to add the or not just to see how it reads. And when we read that, the sentence seems a bit awkward. The investigators did not doubt whether or not blah blah blah. So the two nots don't really make sense, and at the very least the sentence is very awkward. We could try if, but we have the same problem where there isn't a spot to put our then. So what do? What do we choose, if or whether? In reality, neither is important. So the best thing to do would be to get rid of whether and not replace it with if. So we get rid of the whether and replace it with something like that. They did not doubt that they were looking for an experienced career criminal. And that sounds pretty good. One of your exam's favorite idioms to test is the difference between such as and like. Such as means for example. So when I say I enjoy movies such as Star Wars, that means Star Wars is one of the movies that I enjoy. Like, on the other hand, simply means similar to. So when I say I enjoy movies like Star Wars, that means I enjoy movies that are similar to Star Wars, but Star Wars itself may or may not be included in that list. You can pretty much remember that as is just much more literal. So when I say something like Mark walks like a girl, that might mean that he skips a bit or has an extra bounce in his step. But when I say Mark walked to work as a woman, that makes it sound like he went dressed up in a wig and high heels. Here's another one. If I say I drive my car like Batman, that might mean that I drive similar to him or I speed a bit too much. But if I drive my car as Batman, that's a lot more literal. That means I might dress up in a mask and cape and pretend to be Batman as I drive. A less tested rule, and it's actually not a firm rule, and that is that when you're comparing verbs, or a verb comes after your comparison, as is preferred over like, even if you mean just similar to. So if I say I drive my car as Batman drives, because the verb came almost immediately after the as, that is preferred over like. You wouldn't say I drive my car just like Batman drives his car. Simply, again, because the verb is too close. A lot of the idioms you can recognize simply by using them in very simple sentences. And here's a perfect example. I could say, I love you so much. Or I could say, I love you so many. Hopefully, I love you so many sounds really awkward to your ear. even if you don't know the exact reason why many is inappropriate. The difference between much and many really has to do with whether or not what it's describing is countable. So love is this ambiguous idea. You can't count love. So you use much to describe things that are not easily counted. Many is for things that are countable. So if you change the sentence to read, I love so many people, that sounds fine. And that's because many is describing people, which is a countable thing. There's a similar difference between the words less and fewer. Like much, less is for things that are hard to count. For example, you could say, I love you less, but you wouldn't say, I love you fewer. So the sentence below is correct because less is describing pollution, and pollution is something that's hard to count. Meaning you would never say there's 4 pollution or 3 pollution. And fewer is describing polluters, and you could definitely count the number of polluters. When a sentence has the phrase not only and but, any verbs or prepositions that came before the not only don't need to be repeated after the but. So in this case, for brevity, the sentence should read, we should not only work harder, but cross out the we should, but also work longer. The second sentence has the exact opposite problem. It's too short. We have the phrase not only, and but also. The we should comes before the not only, so correctly it's missing from the portion after the but also. However, the work comes after the not only, so we would have to repeat the work after the but also. So we should not only work harder, but also work longer. Let's talk about the difference between and among. Between is for a choice that's made between 2 items. When you use between, you absolutely must have an and. You cannot say, I'm going to choose between ice cream or cake. That's terrible. You have to use and. With among, you also use and, but it's more important to recognize the difference between and among. Between is for 2 items, and among is for 2 or more. And specifically with among, you're allowed to have more than one option. So when I say I'm choosing between ice cream and cake, that means I'm going to have either ice cream or cake, but not both. When I make a choice among ice cream and cake, that means potentially I could have both ice cream and cake. With simple examples, the idioms are pretty easily to recognize. With longer sentences, you may not recognize the idiom right away, but the rule still applies. So in this case, we can see we have between, so we absolutely must have an and after the between, and not or with that. If you read this sentence out loud, it may sound decent to your ear, and that's because the sentence is pretty verbose and complicated. One of the best skills that you can have with idioms is to recognize the difference between your answer choices, and then to check the idiom, you simply want to create simple sentences in your mind, such as we did here. When I asked you to figure out the difference between choosing between ice cream and cake, or choosing among ice cream and cake, even if you didn't know the exact rule, just by living in an English-speaking country, you could get the idea that between means you're choosing one and not both, and among you get more than one choice. And we did the exact same thing with I love you so much and I love you so many. So if you come across an idiom and you're not sure what the correct version of the idiom is, simply create dramatically shorter and simpler sentences, and then choose the answer that seems right to your ear.